Welcome back to the Deep 404. Tonight, I want to talk a little bit about what the Houthis are doing in and around the Red Sea. What we've seen there in the last couple of weeks from the Houthi movement, a group who are officially known as Ansar Allah, or the supporters of God. They are a Shia Islamist group who rose out of Yemen in the 90s as an opposition to the leadership then, who they saw as being corrupt. Seems to be where they basically originated from. Now, their activity in and around the Red Sea over the last few weeks are an example of asymmetric warfare. Their official leader, Mohammed Ali al-Houthi, says that they will target all ships heading to Israel, regardless of their nationality. And has warned international shipping groups against dealing with Israeli companies or Israeli ports. The Houthis are doing this in support of the conflict in Gaza, in support of the Palestinians who are suffering at the present time under Israeli blockades of humanitarian aid. There has been for a period of time, a build-up of humanitarian aid not being allowed in through the Rafah crossing into Gaza. And of course, just in general protest to the bombing campaign being undertaken by the IDF in Gaza at the moment, which since the Hamas October 7th attacks on Israel has been primarily focused on the northern part of the Gaza Strip, but has in the last week, since the conclusion of the 4-day, which is extended to a 7-day ceasefire. Since the recommencement of hostilities, that bombing campaign has progressed now into the southern area of Egypt of Gaza, and so we are even seeing growing calls now on stations such as like CNN with Jake Tapper. Just questioning his Israeli guests on the show as to where is safe in Gaza at the moment for Palestinians. So the Houthis have this week attacked a tanker. They have struck it with a cruise missile. This was a Norwegian tanker, the Strinder. It caught fire. There were reportedly no casualties. And the attack occurred on the bottom of the Red Sea, about 15 nautical miles from the Yemeni port of Mocha. I'll just, for a moment here, just jump over to our map, which I should have prepared earlier, but I had not. Apologies. We just zoom out a little bit here. We'll see the area that we're talking about, and we'll start to see why I'm considering this to be a good example of asymmetric warfare. So Yemen here on the bottom of the Saudi Arabian Peninsula here, and the Red Sea, this area here splitting Egypt and Sudan and Saudi Arabia, is the Red Sea. Now, the Houthis have been operating within the Red Sea, as far up into the Red Sea near Jeddah. A few weeks ago, when the Galaxy Leader was hijacked, that was around this area here of Jeddah, where Houthi forces landed a helicopter onto that tanker. The recent activity has been down around this area, around Yemen itself. The activity over the last few weeks has seen at least 7, now possibly 8 ships attacked. A French frigate 2 days ago come under attack. This French frigate had 2 drones fired at it, which it reportedly shot down with no damage to the French frigate. The USS destroyer, the Carney, It has been involved in a number of engagements and shooting down drones and missiles allegedly fired by the Houthis from Yemen. We are now seeing things like liquid petroleum gas tankers and other vessels being advised to not traverse the Red Sea. So you can see by the position of where Yemen is down here, it has control over the access way into the Red Sea. Now for Israel up here, Israel is able to, through Aqaba here, access the Red Sea and then be able to send freight from southern Israel up through the Suez Canal and out into the Mediterranean, or down through the Red Sea if it wishes to send freight this way around towards India and Asia. What is starting to happen now is that not only are tankers, gas tankers, but other shipping containers and their companies under the pressure of insurance companies, shipping insurance companies, and because of these attacks on freight ships in this area, they are now starting to avoid the Red Sea in its entirety. So this means that by making attacks, one hijacking, two attacks at one American, one French military vessel, and some attacks at a few other freighters, the Houthis have, within a 2-month period, been able to commence the rerouting of global shipping to and from Israel to avoid the Red Sea, which means that in the case of traffic which now needs to avoid the Red Sea, the other option is to now go through the Mediterranean and around Africa. So going all the way around Africa instead of short-circuiting through the Red Sea adds something like 2 weeks travel time to make this big route all the way around Africa this way instead of this little short trip through here. Adds a couple of weeks to travel time. So that's adding cost. Time is money. Travel is money. These ships which are traveling for an extra 2 weeks means that in some cases they'll be running into some sort of SLA concerns. They won't be meeting the agreed times that they would have to deliver goods previously. They have to pay for fuel. They have to pay for their crew for longer. And if they are wishing to avoid that and operate in the Red Sea, they're now starting to run into insurance challenges. So those insurance challenges will be that either they won't get insurance or they'll be paying inflated premiums in order to get insurance. There is also, at the same time, just adding to some of the challenges here, is that the Panama Canal is suffering a severe drought at the moment, and this means that there are shipping delays in the Panama Canal. So it is projected that by February of next year, the Panama Canal will have dropped the volume of shipping from 36 ships today to half of that, to 18 per day. So some of these ships now, which are struggling with the Panama Canal, in some cases, they may also have been looking to transit through the Red Sea, and they're now perhaps unable to do that. So this is having an impact on global shipping. And yet for the Houthis, as far as I'm aware, in these engagements, they have not lost any of their fighters. Now, that may not be the case. There may have been some lost. There will no doubt have been some retaliatory strikes in Yemen. I've seen some reports of that. But in terms of the effort output to the impact they're having, it's a large impact that they're having. A good example of this sort of asymmetric warfare. This, in part, obviously not just because of this, but in part of this reason, US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin is heading back to the Middle East and will be in Israel later this week. And part of what he will be there to do will be to reassure nations that shipping through the Red Sea is safe. There may well be the movement and repositioning of some of the American naval forces in the area to the Red Sea and off the coast of Yemen and Oman, to just bolster confidence in global shipping and ensure safe passage through those areas. It will be interesting to see if the Houthis do continue these attacks on boats over the coming weeks, or if an increased military presence. Remember that the US already have a significant number of naval assets in the area. There are 2 carrier groups there, plus there are other ships. I mean, the 2 carrier groups have been moved over there recently. The US always has a naval presence around this area, obviously around the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, and through the Mediterranean. These are oil shipping transit ways, and so very important to the US that they keep them flowing and they keep the oil flowing through these areas. So yeah, interesting development there. Makes me think of other possible ways in which we might see asymmetric warfare activity evolve. For me, present time, this is just a fantastic example of it. We may start to see, I think, in some areas, perhaps the use of drones by some forces, giving them an asymmetric ability, and we have perhaps seen some of that in the early days of the Israeli IDF entering into Gaza, where there were some videos emerging in those very first days of Hamas fighters leveraging FPV drones in the same way that Russian and Ukrainian forces have been using them in the Ukrainian conflict. But it did seem as though in those first few days they had an asymmetric advantage there, where they were deploying what they had seen be used in Ukraine on the Israeli Defense Forces. And the Defence Forces had perhaps not been quite prepared for that. There are videos showing groupings of Israelis outside in areas not out of FPV drone range, and FPV drones dropping grenades onto those soldiers there. So that's something happening around the area. In the Palestinian states in the West Bank in the last few days, there is continued IDF, Israeli presence and activity there in Jenin, in the West Bank. Israeli forces have reportedly been using large bulldozers again, pulling up, destroying roads and infrastructure in the area. The Al-Razi hospital has reportedly been surrounded and all access points blocked. There is artillery fire on sections of the city of Jenin. And Al Jazeera are reporting that there are 3 other hospitals in Jenin which are surrounded by military equipment. Now, Jenin itself is in the West Bank. It is up in the sort of the northern areas. Oh, we've zoomed in a bit far here. Northern area of the West Bank. So here's Jenin here in this West Bank area. Jenin up there. As I've said before, the West Bank area is not one contiguous block of Palestinian land. Think of it as an archipelago of islands within the area that is called the West Bank. There are I think the majority of the area within the West Bank is not area that Palestinians can freely travel to. The bulk of the area within the wider West Bank is Israeli controlled. Some of the land is Palestinian controlled and some is jointly controlled, but the bulk of that area is actually accessible only to Israelis and not to Palestinians. So fighting continuing in Gaza, but fighting in the West Bank. Now, just remember that interestingly, in the West Bank, Hamas is not present in the West Bank. It is not the leadership in the West Bank. Hamas is the leadership in the Gaza Strip area, and continued tensions with Hezbollah in Lebanon. So Lebanon, just to the north of Israel, forming a border with Israel there. There are further reports that Israel may be preparing, no indication of when exactly, but may be preparing for some sort of a preemptive strike, perhaps, on the southern regions of Lebanon. There are some agreements that certain Hezbollah forces would stay out of the very southern area of Lebanon, an area about 30 kilometres deep. Reports now that those Hezbollah forces may be active within that area. This is what some of the Israeli Defense Force spokespeople are reporting, and that Israel is concerned that because of the military power of Hezbollah, that they are at risk of an attack being launched by Hezbollah into the northern areas of Israel. And so, as I say, there is tension there that there may be perhaps some sort of a preemptive strike being planned coming from Israel into the southern area of Lebanon to try to weaken the Hezbollah capability in that area. Any major now, there's already been skirmishes this whole period of time. There's already been a number of attacks by Hezbollah rockets on Israeli positions within the Israeli border, and likewise there have been Israeli attacks into southern Lebanon. A large attack by Israel would trigger, I imagine, then a large response from Hezbollah. And that then would be a major escalation if that were to occur. You know, Hezbollah has a large number of rockets and missiles in the hundreds of thousands range, and many, if not all of those, are capable of reaching all areas of Israel. So clearly, there would be damage done to Israel if they were to trigger a larger conflict with Hezbollah. And right at the moment, I imagine there are very careful decisions being made about just stabilizing that northern border with Hezbollah and Lebanon, and not activating that at a time where Israel might then find themselves battling Hamas and Hezbollah, having to perhaps even draw some force or at least focus away from Hamas in Gaza to focus on what would be a far larger, far more deadly threat from a full-throated Hezbollah attack from the north. Moving on from what's happening in Israel and moving over to Europe and having a look at Ukraine. Well, in the US, actually, Ukrainian President Zelensky has been in Washington this week, and in a series of meetings today, he's met with a group of senators, both Republican and Democrat senators. Meeting organised by Democrat Schumer, Democrat Senator Schumer. He has met with President Biden himself, gave a public press conference, about a 25-minute press conference where President Biden read heavily from a script and notes. He's also met with House Speaker Mike Johnson. Now, the the interview given by Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson, the interview given by him after was not what President Zelensky would have liked. President Zelensky has gone to the US now publicly to ask for further support. Right now, the US Senate has not voted on a funding bill which would give $60 billion to Ukraine, $60 billion of additional funding, military funding and material, funding to keep the Ukrainian government going, funding to support Ukrainians who have left Ukraine and moved to America. There's a various number of areas where the funding would be applied, but that's $60 billion. The White House has made a request that tied the Ukrainian funding for $60 billion together with about a $15 billion funding package for Israel. And this has been held up. The Republican senators have all agreed and said no. Mike Johnson in the House of Republicans has said very clearly to the White House that you will get your money for Ukraine, but we need two things. We need to have a strategy for Ukraine, a strategy to victory, because right now we're just seeing a request for more money. The US has already given over $100 billion, seeing requests for another $60 billion, and you're not giving us any plan or strategy as to how it will lead to victory in Ukraine. And the other thing that Johnson has said they require before they will approve the bill is they need real movement from the Democrats and from the White House on the southern border with Mexico. Now, this is a big issue in the United States. As I said before, the Democrats see the open border with Mexico as a benefit to them. The way that they manage and present that is that it's an open nation. These people should be allowed to come in, that the Democrat government will help fund them, and the idea being here that those people who move, undocumented immigrants who move to America, will ultimately become Democratic voters. Mike Johnson, in his speech today, gave some numbers indicating that in the last 3 months of this year, October, November, December of 2023, they have seen more people enter, undocumented people enter via the southern border than in the previous year. And on one day recently, they believe there were 12,000 people who entered illegally into the United States. So for Biden, he is really sort of hamstrung. He has a great wall of resistance within his own party to be able to get over to say, okay, we will do something to slow down or to improve the border security. Now, he talks about that. He will say that, yes, there are things that need to be done there. But you remember when Trump was in power, Trump wanted to do something. He wanted to extend the wall and build the wall. And there was great Democratic pushback on that. So now Biden will say the words that they need to fix the problem there, but not actually act upon it. Clearly, the Republicans, they're aware of this and why the Democrats are doing that. And so for that reason, they want this stopped. They don't want all these people turning up and effectively becoming Democrat supporters or voters. But they also see it as a risk where there are undocumented people entering the country and they have no idea who they are or what their intentions are. Given America's position, given America's history, it has managed to upset and piss off many nations around the world. There will no doubt be people who are using this as a means of entering into the United States, and they are doing so with bad intentions and plans to cause problems for the United States. I can see how that could clearly be something that you would do. If you were an aggressor to the United States, you would be looking at that and say, sure, let's try and smuggle some people in who can, cause trouble once they're in there. So the Republicans are saying we need those two things. We need real concrete steps on border security because this can't go on any longer. And we need to have a plan to victory in Ukraine. Both of those are a real challenge for Biden to provide. For the reasons I've said, the border security is a tough one, but the one which is a real challenge now is that strategy to victory in Ukraine. Now, President Zelensky, in his speech today with Joe Biden, was saying all of those things, saying that we've been successful, we're a successful country, our GDP is going to be 5% this year. President Putin has had no successes at all. All of these things which they are saying sound good to the general public who are not following this closely, but the Republican and House senators and Republican members of the House are now becoming well aware that Ukraine is not being successful in this conflict. Russia is beating it. I'll get later on in this video to talk a little bit about the front line and what's happening in Ukraine. But suffice it to say, there is a continued advancement along the line from Russia. Again, in some reports I saw today, talks in some areas of gains in a day by the Russians of over 1 kilometre. Now, there have been a number of these I've read over the last couple of weeks. This is a clear indication that the Ukrainians are on the back foot across the front line, and the Russians are advancing. And the Russians are making their advances too in areas that have been reinforced, fortified, and would have perhaps expected to have held longer. Avdiivka is an example of that, where again there are reports today of the pincers closing around Avdiivka, of large gains being made by the Russians on the southern industrial area, and even the coke plant area starting to become surrounded. As like the township of Stepova is now being claimed by the Russians, and they are starting to then launch heavy artillery strikes on the smaller townships just to the northwest of the coke plant area. So while President Zelensky is saying all these things that sound really good, the 5% GDP growth, that's what the IMF is suggesting, something like that. While I find that personally difficult to believe, remember this is a year-on-year growth after last year when the Ukrainian economy crashed in the first war of the Russian special military operation, or the Ukrainian war. So they're starting at a very low point and building up with that 5% possible GDP growth. So it's going to be very difficult for Biden to be able to sell to the Republican senators that you are going to see victory in Ukraine and we're going to have a win. Now, Alexander Mercouris today on the Duran, again, always great insight and looking at things from different angles. His take on this was that, because remember, we're in compressed time here. We have until Friday, we have until the 15th before American Congress rises for its recess. It then goes on leave. A new Congress forms on the 3rd of January. But there's no guarantee that they will actually be back sitting, debating these things on the 3rd of January. And if it's anything like this year, the start of January 2023, Congress, while it forms on the 3rd, didn't actually return to work until the 21st or 23rd of January. So we may be weeks away from further debate on this, which means that there's $60 billion for Ukraine and $16 billion for Israel may not be signed off until the end of January. Now, by the end of January in Ukraine, things may have deteriorated to such a point that there will be no convincing the Republicans that success will occur in Ukraine, because things may have just gone so far south that that's just not something they could pull off. But Alexander Mercouris spoke of the fact that in politics, a day is a long time, an hour can be a long time. So we have a few days before this Congress leaves. And if this deal were to be signed off, Alexander suggested that the reasoning there might be, as has come up in some announcements in the last few days, that actually of the $60 billion, a lot of it will not go directly to Ukraine, but will go back into America to produce things that will go to Ukraine. And so what Alexander was hinting at here is that this $60 billion, depending on how it is structured, may well flow to the states and hometowns of these senators, ensuring jobs in those areas and things like that. If that money is going to, large military, industrial organisations and companies that are producing things for war, then they're hiring people in those states. That looks good for those senators. And if that money is going to these large military manufacturing organisations who have lobbying ability and the ability to donate money to super PACs, the action committees for these senators to help them get elected. As we know, in America, you need a lot of money to get elected. That may be the strategy that is used here to be able to get this funding approved in time, if it is structured in such a way that there is significant benefit to enough senators. So no. As Alexander was saying, he was choosing his words very carefully. I think I see what he was getting at. I think it would be completely legal for a military company to fund a super PAC or an action committee to get someone elected, and where they get their money from, I guess, if it's given to them by the government for work to be done, well, that's all legal, that cycle. Anyhow. So if we do see funding happen, that may be part of the reason why, because the two things that Mike Johnson appears to be looking for, it's doubtful that he will get them. Now, if it is funded and Mike Johnson doesn't get those two things, concrete steps on the border and a clear strategy that he can articulate about the path to success in Ukraine, that then brings into question Mike Johnson and his character and what role he is going to play as the Speaker of the House. At this stage, he seems to be holding his ground on those things. This is now becoming a bit of a finger-pointing activity between the Democrats and the Republicans. Now, the Democrats are starting to say it's the Republicans' fault that Ukraine has failed because they didn't fund the money. And the Republicans are going, well, it's your fault we didn't fund it because you didn't deal with the border. And the border is more important to domestic Americans than helping some country in Europe, which doesn't actually directly threaten us if they were to lose their fight with Russia. So we will see. We will see what happens there. Interesting. There is a lot of rhetoric coming out from Zelensky, of course, but also from Biden and some from other White House spokespeople and from European leaders, of course, we're seeing. But the bringing out the old tropes of if we don't stop Putin in Ukraine, he will continue on and Europe will be at threat. US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin this week in a piece of news that blew up on Twitter where Tucker Carlson apparently confirmed to Elon Musk that Lloyd Austin had in a closed-door meeting said, if you don't fund Ukraine, we will send your uncles, your brothers, your cousins to war. Basically saying, if you don't give us the money, then we'll be sending US boys and men to war to fight in Europe, fight in Ukraine. Now, I read an article by the military today where they were winding that back and saying, no, he didn't say that. What they kind of said was, well, he did say that we might have to send US forces to go and fight, but didn't say those exact words. Well, what exact words did he say? Oh, I can't tell you. So, good chance that Lloyd Austin did say something like that. Regardless, it was confirmed that he did say we might have to send them to fight. So this is what's being used now to stir up sort of the public support for this additional funding. The threat that or if Putin beats Ukraine, we'll have to send our American boys over there to fight Russia because he'll try and take over Europe. I've seen no evidence whatsoever that Vladimir Putin is at all interested in taking Europe. I don't even think he was really interested in going into Ukraine a year ago or 18 months ago. And had there not been NATO expansionism, that continued push to drive NATO into Ukraine, and the announcement of the Bucharest summit in 2008 that they would be let in, if that all hadn't happened, I don't think we would have this war happening now, and Ukraine would be, or perhaps working to be being a prosperous country. Remember that Ukraine's a very resource-rich country, or it was, but areas of Ukraine now where many of the resources are, the wheat belt growing area, that is area that is falling under Russia's control now. That those eastern oblasts, Zaporozhye and Donetsk, Luhansk and Kharkiv oblasts, they are all falling now under Russian control. And as we've said on this show, many people have said, if the Ukrainian government doesn't negotiate relatively soon with Russia to bring an end to this conflict, it looks as though Russia will continue to grind westward, ultimately pushing in the northern flanks of the war now, past the Oskol River and Kupiansk and onto Kharkiv and then onto Kiev itself. Pushing up past Zaporozhye and then pushing down to the southwest past Mykolaiv and Odessa, and claim those areas. So get themselves all the way to the Dnieper and then down and take Odessa. And at that stage, the Russians could then just say, we have enough. Yeah, we'll stop now, because they will have then denied what remains of Ukraine of port access, making it a landlocked nation, and having claimed all of the eastern oblasts and effectively taking all of the good resource-rich areas of Ukraine. This is a real possibility which day by day the Ukrainians are getting closer and closer to. Remember that the plan of the US and Ukraine in the offensive, which started in July of this year, was to cut down from Zaporozhye, get down to the Sea of Azov and cut off Crimea and have a massive bargaining chip and be able to say to the Russians, come on, come to the table, let's talk. We now have Crimea. We can bargain about things. But their offensive failed. They didn't get to the Sea of Azov. They didn't capture Crimea. And now they're left on the back foot with ongoing reports coming out now that they need to defend. Reports about Zelensky suggesting they need to defend all the way from Mykolaiv, all the way from Kiev, all the way down the line to Mykolaiv and Odessa. Which is a massive, it's thousands of kilometre long line. Trying to build defensive positions along that line now, I think is too late. The amount of resources that have been poured into trying to recapture Bakhmut, which has been unsuccessful again in the last 2 weeks, and today more reports of Russian advance to the west of Bakhmut, or Artyomovsk. Bakhmut as the Ukrainians call it and Artyomovsk as the Russians call it. Avdiivka, the brigades upon brigades that have been poured in there to try to defend Avdiivka, and it is rapidly falling to Russian control. Kleshchiivka, Andriivka, south of Donetsk, these also falling to Russian control. Mariinka has just fallen to the Russians. So the Ukrainians really should have been taking some of those forces 3 months ago, and instead of putting them into this battle for Avdiivka and Bakhmut, which has been a disaster in terms of Ukrainian soldiers lost and wounded and equipment lost, similar with the fighting in the Veremka ledge around Robotny and Verbova, which has just chewed up Ukrainian resources. They could have used a bulk of those forces to prepare to reinforce and fortify, so that if the Russians do decide to move westward, that would be far more difficult for them. Right now, they'll be trying to do that under increased pressure, and we can see that the Russians are able to reach out to wherever they like to within Ukraine. Last night, again, big reports of missile strikes in Kiev, drone strikes in Odessa. There are reports that 45 people were injured in Kiev last night because of the Russian missile and drone attack and the air defense response. Now, what is reports of a hospital being damaged? What is not clear at this stage is what did what damage. And for those who have followed this channel or have been following this conflict for some time, you'll know that there have been multiple occasions where Ukrainian news sources have claimed that Russians have bombed particular civilian facilities, one being a church in Odessa as a good example. However, within hours after that, another one being a market in Ukraine, again, within hours after that, video footage and evidence of the scene came out to show that the damage that had been done hadn't been by the Russian Iskanders and Kinzhals, these hypersonic and supersonic missiles with massive destructive power. If those sort of things, had they hit this church or this market, there would be nothing left of them. In fact, what had happened were failed Ukrainian air defense missiles had been sent up to attempt to intercept. They'd failed to intercept and had crashed and exploded. In the case of the church, there was a lot of photographic and video evidence of the small peppering damage done to walls, which you would expect from an air defense missile, a fragmentation type missile, not the sort of damage you would expect to see from an Iskander or something like that. So last night, those reports still coming out, but I would suggest that probably there has been serious damage done by the Russian missiles, and possibly some of the civilian damage has been due to either failed Ukrainian air defense systems or air defense that may have been successful and has then destroyed a missile above a civilian area en route to its military target, and the debris falling down has caused some damage. It's difficult in Kiev particularly to get out a great deal of open sourced video. Ever since a few months ago, when Iskanders destroyed a Patriot system in Kiev, there has been strong suppression of that from the Ukrainian military intelligence forces. And there have been stories coming out of people being arrested by them and detained by them because they have posted to social media video footage of air defense working, or air defense being destroyed, or whatever it might be. And it's understandable that you don't want your enemy finding out about your air defense, where it is, how effective it is, what type it is. So for those reasons, you can understand why there is a bit of a lockdown on that. So there's not a great deal that has come out yet to just identify or clarify exactly what damage has been done there. What is interesting, which again I read about this today and on Telegram channels I've seen over the last week, is that there are now increasing cases of open source reports, people posting to Telegram saying there's missiles overhead before air defense, air sirens are being activated. So it seems as though some of these Russian missile attacks are able to now circumvent the remaining air defense systems, Odessa, this sort of thing, and people on the ground are detecting them first. Again, the reports last night in Kiev that this happened, that there were strikes and explosions, and then there was air defense sirens going off. People weren't getting a warning beforehand. Just going back to President Zelensky's speech with Joe Biden today, he was asked some questions. He was asked a question which I believe was in response to Senator James Vance's statements. So earlier this week, Senator Vance had said, "It is in America's interest to recognise that Ukraine will have to cede some territory to the Russians, and we need to put an end to these hostilities." He said it's both in our interests and theirs to end the fighting and put an end to the loss of life. When it comes to the Ukrainian issue, everyone with a head on their shoulders knows that it will end in negotiations. The idea that Ukraine would return Russia to the 1991 borders was absurd. No one really believed in it. So this is an American senator. As I was saying, it's going to be difficult to convince them of that item that Mike Johnson said they need, which is a strategy to victory. So he has said that, look, we're just going to accept the fact that Ukraine is going to have to cede some territory to the Russians. And again, I think he's probably aware of the fact that the longer this goes on, the more territory will be ceded. Now, President Zelensky was asked about this, and he denied, said, of course not, we will not be ceding any territory to Russians. The idea was absurd, really. So Zelensky has not really had a good day in Washington. He would have loved to have got the big thumbs up that he's got the $60 billion. Now, he did receive, President Joe Biden has announced another $200 million of aid. This is separate funding which Joe Biden is able to draw down upon. This is not an approval for another $60 billion to be used in 2024. $200 million. Again, this is played up. Biden saying we're continuing to support Ukraine. And Ukraine is not running out of all money yet. The IMF, their board has this, and President Zelensky met with the chief, Kristalina Georgieva, early this week, because the board of the IMF has approved a $900 million disbursement. There are going to be some strict debt restructuring requirements for Ukraine so the IMF can see their money being paid back. They are still getting some money from Europe, but the big pieces are being held up. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban is holding up EU money. There's billions of euros being held up there. And here we now have the American Congress holding up the big dollars, the billions, not the millions. Now, the $200 million that Biden has been able to approve, that will make headlines in the US, in the Democratic-friendly press, because, again, that sounds positive. The general public here, for most people, $200 million is a large amount. You hear that, you think, oh, things are still going good. We're still supporting them. But in reality, that's a drop. I mean, $200 million is a day of Ukraine's war expenses, everything added up, trying to run the country at this stage. And the country really is on life support. That funding from the US and the EU is needed, and if it doesn't come through, then Ukraine really is facing a very hard and bleak future. And as I say, the increased likelihood of a Russian advancement, perhaps to the Dnieper, until the Russians are happy that they have enough land to be able to just weaken and force the current Ukrainian government to either change, or if they don't change, regardless, to admit that they will become neutral and they will not join NATO. Now, President Biden said today, yep, the road to NATO is still there for Ukraine, and no doubt Ukraine will be in NATO. We just need to finish this war first and meet all of the requirements. But let's not talk about what those requirements might be. But again, sounds positive, sounds nice. Biden, though, he did say something that the script has changed a little bit for Biden, in that he has said he said in his speeches today that he will provide support to Ukraine for as long as we can. Now, it used to be we'll provide support to Ukraine for as long as it takes. President Biden is now saying we'll provide support to Ukraine for as long as we can. Now, this is in contrast to his statements about providing funding to Israel, where he has said that we will provide funding until Hamas is completely destroyed. Again, that is a bind that Biden has put himself into, which is going to be tough for him to get out as this conflict in Israel continues. And he's going to end up in a situation like this where, again, people will be throwing his words back at him because they will ultimately be stopping this level of funding once they get it started, once they get the $16 billion. They will ultimately be stopping that, as they are not going to be able to remove Hamas from Gaza in its entirety and not completely destroy it. The only way to do that would be to destroy all of the people in Gaza. And if that occurs, then the US has a bigger problem, because that is the sort of thing which, as Iran's foreign minister has said just this week, if that type of thing continues or looks like it's going to happen or does happen, that will cause an explosion of tensions in the area. But a contrast between what is now being said about Israel, that the support will be there until Hamas are completely destroyed, versus Ukraine, it's now, we'll support you as long as we can. However, we are struggling to get funding, and we realize that if we don't get funding for you in the next few weeks, well, even Tony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, has said that if Congress doesn't take action to approve the additional aid, then what they're doing now, the $200 million, will be one of the last security assistance packages that they will be able to provide to Ukraine. Because I'm recognizing that goes on, Ukraine really can't sustain a couple of months without its funding. If that happens, it will just fall apart. Pressure on the Zelensky government will rise to a point where he'll be overthrown in some respect. There's already a number of challenges there. Kirill Bodanov, the head of military intelligence, General Zaluzhny, who has the support of the military, Arestovich, a previous advisor to President Zelensky, are among those who are being spoken about as possible successors to Zelensky. Again, Zelensky seems to be in a position now where his complete reticence and he's pushing back on any suggestion that he might negotiate with the Russians is putting him in a position where once the US do want negotiation to occur, he may need to be moved sideways so that they can put someone in place who the Russians feel that they can actually negotiate with. So, as I said, I would talk a little bit about the Battlefront. All along the line, we have Russian successes and tactical advances being made. We have continued reports of Ukrainian soldiers either retreating from areas. We have reports of Ukrainian soldiers who are surrendering in different areas. Remember that the weather is getting very tough in Ukraine. The winter is setting in, the frosts are coming, the temperatures are dropping well below freezing for extended periods of time now. Frostbite is becoming a real concern in the area of the Kherson region, where they're getting across the rivers. They're getting across the Dnieper River and working in those areas around the islands. Those Ukrainian soldiers there, reports have come out that they're all suffering from frostbite there. I will go through the Ministry of Defense. This is the Russian Ministry of Defense, their daily summary for what's happened in the last 24 hours. I'll just go through that relatively quickly. In the Kupiansk direction, The Zapad group of forces are operating. They have engaged heavily the AFU, or the Armed Forces of Ukraine's 57th Mechanized Brigade units close to Sinkovka. The reporting from the Russian Ministry of Defense is that the Ukrainians have lost up to 105 troops killed and wounded in the last day. The Ministry of Defence has indicated that they're able to get these troop loss numbers for the Ukrainians based upon intercepted communications that they can make. 2 armoured fighting vehicles and 1 Gvozdika self-propelled artillery system destroyed in Kupiansk yesterday. Again, these self-propelled artillery systems are of great loss to the Ukrainians. Many of these they are unable now to replace, and they are losing the ability to counteract the Russian artillery. In moving south down the line, Krasny Liman, this is where the centre group of forces operate. Up to 185 Ukrainian troops killed and wounded in the last 24 hours. 3 motor vehicles have also been destroyed. Moving down then to the Donetsk area, which is where the Yug group of forces operate. There's been heavy fighting on the western outskirts of Mariinka as the Russians push Ukrainians out of Mariinka. Also, heavy fights against the AFU's 24th and 93rd Mechanized Brigades near Kleshevka and Kurimovka. Reportedly, the Ukrainian losses in Donetsk are 240 Ukrainian troops killed and wounded. So that's, that's, if these numbers are correct, that's averaging, that's 10 men killed or wounded in the Donetsk area every hour. So every 6 minutes, just in that area, there's someone being killed or wounded on the Ukrainian side. 2 armoured personnel carriers and 4 motor vehicles. In terms of counter-battery warfare in Donetsk, the Ukrainians reportedly lost 2 M-Star-B howitzers, 2 D-20 howitzers, as well as 2 Gvozdika self-propelled artillery systems. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pieces of equipment at least. This seems to be about the average at the moment. I mean, going through, 7 a day, or it's 40 or more sort of pieces of artillery equipment being reported destroyed each week. Earlier today, I saw footage, reportedly new footage, of 2 Ukrainian tanks struck by Lancets within one area, in Kupiansk area. Two tanks and another vehicle taken out by Lancets. So there is corroboration for some of these reports here. Moving to the South Donetsk area, which is where the Vostok group of forces are operating. They've engaged near Novomykhailivka, the AFU's 79th Air Assault Brigade. The reported Ukrainian losses are 70 Ukrainian troops killed and wounded, 3 armoured fighting vehicles, 1 Akatsiya self-propelled artillery system, as well as 2 D-20 howitzers. Now again, the self-propelled ones, losing those is a real problem. The self-propelled ones often have a long longevity or lifespan because they can shoot and scoot. They can set up somewhere. They can team up with a drone reconnaissance unit who they can detect the target, fire at a target, use drone reconnaissance to calibrate, fire again, and then move and get out of there. And so they don't suffer perhaps the same fate as more entrenched positioned artillery pieces which sit in an area, fire. If their location is detected, they then come under fire. It's very difficult to pick them up rapidly and move them away. So for the Ukrainians in one day to have lost already 4 pieces of mobile artillery is a big loss. And 2 D-20 howitzers in the South Donetsk region as well. In the Zaporozhye region, in this area near Novosilovka, the 80th Air Assault Brigade has come under attack by the Russians. Reported Ukrainian losses are 70 troops killed and wounded and 3 motor vehicles. Moving down to the Kherson direction, here in the Kamishani area of the Kherson region, 35 Ukrainian troops and 2 motor vehicles reported as lost. And in terms of artillery, 2 D-20 howitzers and 2 Gvozdika self-propelled artillery systems were destroyed. So 2 more of them. So 6 in the day. 6, was it? Yeah, possibly at least 6 mobile self-propelled artillery systems lost for the Ukrainians in one day. I think that's the highest number I can remember for a single day in some time. So, yeah, things looking very bad for Ukraine. It just reminds me of John Mearsheimer and what he has been saying for years now. So really, he's been saying since 2014 that this would be the end result, that Ukraine would be wrecked, that the US is leading Ukraine down the primrose path, and that they will be wrecked by Russia in this conflict. And it is what we are seeing. We are just seeing the slow decimation of Ukraine's young and middle-aged men. The average age in the Ukrainian armed forces now is something like 43. A year ago, it was 27. So, they've lost so many of the young men that they're needing to now mobilise, conscript older men to be able to make up the numbers. And people have commented that even if Ukraine does get the funding that it wants, it still needs to get the material. It still needs to get the artillery shells, the 155mm artillery shells, which neither Europe, NATO, or the United States can provide in the numbers that are required. And even if it were to get all the tanks and equipment and planes that it wanted, it needs the men to be able to command them. And it just doesn't have that. It's lost so many of them. What's remaining now are a whole bunch of young under 20-year-olds, kids are at university and things like that. No previous military training, no ability to have the time to grow the experience, to know how to command a tank successfully, to know how to command a tank in unison with a group of tanks and with drones and aircraft. So the Ukrainians are really in trouble, and it's sad to see. It's devastation of a nation. It's not something that I think you would have expected to be talking about in 2023. In Central Europe, the devastation and destruction of a nation in Central Europe, and particularly in the way that it has occurred, where in March of 2022, President Zelensky and Putin's teams were negotiating on a settlement, an agreement which would have seen the conflict stopped then. That was a possibility at that stage, which was thwarted by the West, by Boris Johnson, by the United States, no doubt being involved in that decision to convince President Zelensky to take on Russia, and that he would be given all the support he needed to be able to do that. Now we've seen that hasn't been the case, and that the US have fought an unsuccessful proxy war against Russia via Ukraine, and that Ukraine has been the big loser here. Russia has lost some troops. By all accounts, a manageable number. The media zona, BBC reporting, where they actually look at obituaries and information that you can open source to try and determine how many Russians have been killed in this conflict, servicemen. I mean, I think their upper limit was around, they're estimating around 70,000. So the Russians have lost some troops here. They have lost some equipment, yes, but they have rapidly moved themselves to a war footing where they are now producing military equipment at a level which is outmatching what the combined NATO nations and the US can manage. So this has not been successful for the US, this proxy war. And just a couple of things, I'll finish up on this, but again, technology coming out of Russia, which has been driven by this conflict. Reports now of Russian aquatic drones going into testing in February. A 4-motor drone, which has a range of 1 kilometre underwater, can travel down to depths of 30 metres, can be used for some surveillance, but also can carry a 5-kilogram explosive on it. So it seems as though the Russians have learnt or had enough of coming under fire of Ukrainian drones in the Black Sea around Crimea and the Russian ports there, and are now rapidly developing their own underwater drone capability. And also seeing some more video of drones on the front line, medic drones. If you recall, I think it was back in June or July, we saw the first video coming out of a drone unit, sort of 4 car tires on a boxy square with a hook, a single arm and a hook, which was shown going out, the hook just roughly engineered to hit across an injured soldier's body and latch onto his belt or a hoop on his uniform and just drag him to safety. And that's what it was doing. In the video footage I've seen this week of one which was perhaps slightly larger and had a soldier laying on his back of this unit, and it was again a similar sort of thing, a radio controlled or perhaps somewhat autonomously controlled drone. So we're seeing this war push drone technology to new levels in all areas. Obviously in the area of the Lancets and the Orlans, which are now working in teams and swarms with enhanced AI capability, allowing them to travel and navigate even if they lose communications with their pilots. Development of these underwater drones now, and these land-based ones as well. All right. I think I will leave it there for tonight. I will hope to get another episode out in the next day or so. I hope you're enjoying the channel. If you have enjoyed this show and you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe, share with other people that you think would enjoy the channel, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon.